I want to thank everyone here for traveling, many of you from around the world, to come spend a couple days with us. We greatly appreciate the fact that folks spend as much time as they do covering our company and our community. When I'm going to talk a little bit today, well, first of all, I should mention that we're in a room known as the Odeon, and we're in 999, which is a relatively new office for us. But the Odeon, as I'm sure some folks here would recognize, is a name that the Greeks used for their early theaters. And they would typically do poetry readings in an Odeon. At one point in time, I thought I was going to do this presentation in sonnet form, but I will spare you that today. But what I'd like to talk about is Airbnb for everyone, our path to becoming a 21st century company. It really breaks down into three specific categories. First, I'm going to talk about the big global challenges that we see out there, just existentially for the world. Secondly, talk about the importance of tech taking responsibility, and in particular Airbnb taking responsibility. And third, how Airbnb is designed to align our stakeholders, which really relates to this concept and vision of being a 21st century company. So let me begin by talking about those big global challenges that we see. The first challenge that we see, and everyone is dealing with it, is the global challenge of climate change. 16 of the last 17 years have been the hottest on record. 2016 was the hottest ever recorded. Last year was a pretty close second. CO2 levels are getting to unsustainable levels, and they pose obviously an enormous challenge. If we don't hit the Paris targets, the multiplier effect will accelerate the impact of climate on all of us. And at the end of the day, this impacts real people. This is not an abstract concept. I think we have seen in incredibly tragic and sad ways the impact it's had on real people, particularly over the last year or so. The second big challenge that we see out there is the economic inequality. The gap, and these stats are from the US, I have to pick one country, and since we're here in the US, I'm using US stats. But the economic inequality gap continues to rise. Economic mobility continues to go down. Here in the US, this may end up being, for millennials, may be the first generation that potentially is not able to make or exceed the amount of money that their parents made. What that is leading to is something that is called a new Gilded Age. By the way, that's Dylan's car right there. But the fact that there is a real challenge out there when it comes to what we're dealing with in an economic inequality. And this also has a real impact on people. We're seeing this in terms of jobs on factory floors, jobs for people working in grocery stores, even going to more white-collar jobs like x-ray technicians and lawyers and accountants being impacted by this. Takes us to the third challenge, which is, are we going to live in an open or closed world? Something President Obama talked about in his farewell address. But we're seeing all the signs of this out there. A loss of trust, which is leading to a loss of faith in institutions. Rising levels of loneliness, which is leading to depression. There's actually official work being done in the UK in and around this. My former boss, President Clinton, talked about the idea and the challenge of polarization leading to tribalism. And as we think about these issues, they really do pose this question: do we want to live in an open world, or do we want to live in a closed world? I think we know where a closed world takes us. A closed world takes us to that tribalism. A closed world takes us to that isolationism. A closed world takes us to that nativism. An open world takes us in a very different direction. An open world leads to health being spread around. It leads to knowledge being shared. It leads to jobs and economic activity that are lifting many more people. And at the center or foundation of an open world is travel. This is obviously very relevant to us. I think Maya Angelou put it well when she talked about you can belong to every place when you belong to no place. And travel has always been a catalyst for the advancement of the human condition, from humans traveling out from the Olduvai Gorge to the moon. Migration led to humans populating the planet. Immigration led to economic prosperity for humans. This is actually the ship that my grandparents came over from. Innovation led to new horizons for humans. Integration led to human connection. And exploration will be critical to the future of the human species. So Airbnb's mission is to belong anywhere. In 2016, at the end of 2016, Brian Chesky, our CEO, announced that Airbnb was going to become an end-to-end travel platform. And really what was motivating that was this idea that we wanted to become a platform where anyone could belong anywhere, where everyone could belong anywhere. A couple weeks ago, Brian sent a letter to our community talking about how Airbnb wanted to be a 21st century company, a company that was going to look to align and balance the interests of its stakeholders. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Today, what you saw was our roadmap to get to this aspirational number of 1 billion people. If we're able to do that, that really will mean that we're executing against the mission that we have laid out. Now, in saying this, I do want to be mindful of the fact that you're here in Silicon Valley. Sometimes out here, we tend to talk about the world as if we're going to live in a utopia. We don't believe that. We actually think that Voltaire's skepticism is really important. I know I'm with a room full of distinguished and august members from the Fourth Estate. I know you bring a healthy degree of skepticism. I think that's really important. I think the way we need to think about things, and the way I know that we are at Airbnb, is we need to be able and willing to take responsibility. Tech is in the middle of an awful lot right now, and technology and tech companies are global citizens. And as global citizens, we need to be responsible. Now, of course, technology has been disruptive historically. In fact, you can make the argument that the single biggest disruptive technology ever is when humans harnessed fire. The harnessing of fire allowed humans to cook meat. The cooking of meat allowed the human brain to grow. And that gave what we in Silicon Valley would call humans escape velocity from the animal kingdom. But fire also led to the beginning of community. Families would huddle around the warmth. Strangers would come in from the night. Tribes were formed, villages were formed. Again, the origin of community. And what we've seen here in the US, really over the last 250 years, going in 50-year increments, is how technology has impacted economies and in turn impacted society. 1800 to 1850, advances in plow technology helped fuel Western expansionism. Forts and trading posts emerged. 1850 to 1900, steam power led to cities emerging along waterways. 1900, arguably one of the first network technologies, electricity, saw the development of vertically integrated cities. And then post-World War II, the car literally led to people driving out to the suburbs. Well, today, we're in the midst of the digital age, being driven by technology like the microchip. Now, this age, though, is different than what we've seen in the past. The industrial age took, as I said, about 250 years to happen. What we're going through right now is taking place in 25 years. And so the speed, the scale, the scope is just fundamentally different. This chart up here, hopefully you can see, goes to the scale. These were the top 5 companies in the world in 2001, measured by a market cap. As you can see, they are basically mirror images of the industrial age economy. Today, the top 5 companies in the world are all these tech platforms, massive in terms of just their scale. And as you can see, the Facebook and Tencent are tied for number 5, and they sort of go back and forth depending on currency on a daily basis. But if you sort of went behind those, you would see the next 3 or 4 are all Chinese companies, which sort of projects where we're going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. And the scale of these companies are just things that we've never seen in human society. The US has a population of about 324 million. There's any number of platforms which have consumer populations that are infinitely bigger. Now, of course, tech has brought many, many benefits. We see them every day. We feel them every day. But tech has also brought some real challenges, and they're coming. Whether it's drone deliveries, whether it's cryptocurrency impacting tax collection, people living in segmented digital bubbles, fake news. We're seeing this day in and day out. And as big as those changes are, they're going to look like lemonade stands compared to what's coming next. Because what's next is the age of AI, robots, machines. Here in the US, nearly 50% of all jobs could be replaced or displaced over the next 20 years. For every robot, it costs 6 jobs. And Tom Friedman was right when he effectively said that the US is not losing jobs to Mexico, it's losing jobs to microchips. This image shows an actual robotic concierge at a hotel. So as I said earlier, tech really does have a responsibility to get aligned, because what's going on now is generating tremendous stress in society. Now, I was a history major in college. I continue to like to enjoy my history, as folks here may know. But I think this quote, really sort of sums up what I think we all need to be thinking about, which is if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so, earlier I had talked about the last Gilded Age. I do think there's some lessons in it, because what came out of that last Gilded Age here in the US was an era of progressivism. Teddy Roosevelt was president, but what progressivism really led to was the introduction of some specific policies that helped make sure that as many interests were aligned and balanced so that the industry of the time would work as well as possible for as many people as possible. Out of this came 40-hour work week, safety laws, minimum wage, women's right to vote, a whole series of laws and bills and regulations designed to help align interests. Well, today, we basically face three big major economic models out there. The first is the hierarchical model. This really is the legacy of the industrial age. Under this model, the entity that controls the supply chain makes the vast majority of the revenue, whether it's responsible for the creation of the wealth or not. The second model is what's been called the ad-based model. In the ad-based model, you have users who typically are giving up their data in order to be able to access a platform. It's based on algorithms. Those algorithms generate data that is then sold for advertising dollars. Again, in this model, a disproportionate amount of the economics flow to the platform, which is playing the gatekeeper role here. But it also has some unintended consequences. The algorithms tend to reward emotion, and the emotion that tends to be the most intense is usually negative emotion. And I think we've seen some of the challenges and consequences that have come from that. And then the third model is the community-based model, the community platform model. On that model, there is not a gatekeeper. There's an entity that sometimes helps provide an infrastructure. But under this model, the vast majority of the revenue and economics go out to the grassroots. And this model really only works at an optimal level if both the buyer and the seller or the various stakeholders really have an aligned interest. Now, this is not the first time we've seen a model like this. In fact, here in the United States, our model for government is very much based on a model of balancing interests. When our founding fathers created the Constitution, it was informed by Enlightenment philosophy. And coming out of that was this idea that you would balance interests and you'd have a form of government that really was seeking to align the various stakeholders through a real balancing, a structure that was designed to do that. It's actually talked about in Federalist Paper 51, Federalist Paper number 10. And so that takes us to about 5 or 6 blocks from where we're standing right now. This is Rouse Street, which is the apartment where the founders were living. You heard the story earlier today. I think probably many of you have heard it before. But Joe and Brian were living together, struggling with their rent, came up with this idea of creating a website to be able to list bedrooms. From those bedrooms, they began to offer whole homes. And then from whole homes, you could do igloos. You could even do tree houses, as we saw today. And a few years ago, on Halloween night, you could have rented Count Dracula's castle if you were interested. But ultimately, these two of the three, Brian and Joe, were art school graduates. They had come from a background where they really had been taught and learned to design systems to optimize for humans. And so, in their mid-20s, when they sort of came up with this idea, they designed a platform that was really designed to be this community model. They understood that their company, Airbnb, would only do well if guests did well. The guests would only do well if hosts did well. Hosts would only do well if communities did well. And so really from the beginning, there was this understanding that they wanted to align the different interests. But what stood in the middle or behind all of this, I think, was something that was just fundamentally there. This was the magic sauce ultimately in the whole idea. And that was a fundamental belief from our founders in humans. And you see this in this rating system, right? We have a 5-star rating system. If you're not consistently getting 5 stars as a host or a guest, you get migrated off the platform pretty quickly. that leads to higher levels of trust on Airbnb. Over 60% of our consumers learn about Airbnb from a friend or family member. You typically don't see this, particularly in an era where you see trust really being degraded. This saves us enormous costs in terms of having to advertise or promote ourselves. Our community does that for us, but that's because it's based on this design that actually drives trust as a result. We've worked with Stanford University to think about how we can use this trust. What we've seen is that our rating system potentially can be used to actually help overcome historical biases that may exist in society. And I always like to tell the story that I spent about 20 years, I had my own business, I worked in government, I often traveled in hotels. I never once got up in the morning and ever made my bed. Since about 2013 or so, I've been traveling on Airbnbs, and every time I stay in an Airbnb, I get up in the morning and I make my bed. I do that because I want to help keep my 5-star rating, but also because I understand that I'm staying in someone's home, and I need to treat it like it's my own home. So let's go around that sort of virtuous cycle that I just described, that design. Let's talk about the guests. Today, we've been blessed to have 300 million guest arrivals on the platform. 81,000 cities we're in, 191 countries. Since the movie The Black Panther is out, we're hoping to be allowed into Wakanda at some point here in the near future. But as I'm talking here, we have about 400 guests checking in every 2 minutes. Depending on how quickly I talk, somewhere between 5,000 or 6,000 guests will have checked in by the end of this presentation. Now, Airbnb's mission, as I've touched on, is that everyone can belong anywhere. And what Brian announced today really is focusing on that everyone piece. I think we've done a pretty good job over the last 10 years on that anywhere component. We're really now focused on that everyone piece. And so you had Airbnb for everyone when it comes to our property types. We already have shared rooms, shared spaces, whole homes. Today, going forward, we're now going to have family homes, you're going to have vacation homes, you're going to have unique properties, you're going to have boutiques, you're going to have B&Bs. And then similarly with collections, it will make it easier for that business traveler or that family traveler to be able to use the site and access the site so that it works as well as possible for them. Let's talk about our hosts. Today, we have 4.5 million listings, bigger than the top 5 hotel chains put together. And the economics that our platform has generated for hosts has been significant. $16 million will be generated for our hosts in 2018. $40 billion have been generated for them since the platform was founded. Our hosts make the vast majority of the money. An experienced host makes 80%. A homes host makes up to 97%. And so let's look at what that looks like in the United States. In the US, a typical Airbnb host rents their home 42 times a year. They keep 97% of the money, and they make $7,200 a year. I want to pause on this for a second. I've traveled all over the world. We talked earlier about the challenge of economic inequality. I almost always end up in a conversation, whether it's with a president, a prime minister, a senator, a governor, mayor, whomever it may be, about what's going on from a government policy perspective on economic inequality in that particular country, city, market. And eventually I get to a place in the conversation where I ask, I'll do this as if I was in the US, do you have a government program that is generating $7,200 a year in supplemental income from someone using what is typically their greatest expense, their home, without a single taxpayer dollar being spent? I've yet to get an answer on that. And I say that respectfully. I'm all ears if it's out there. And I'm not suggesting that Airbnb is the answer to economic inequality. It most certainly isn't. It's a much, much more complex and complicated answer than that. But I know that it is playing an incredibly important role for our hosts who are dealing with this. More than half of our hosts actually depend on the economics that they get from being on Airbnb to meet their monthly needs. And a couple weeks ago, we were really excited to see the New Deal meet the new economy when Fannie Mae, a legacy agency from the Franklin Roosevelt administration, which had been established to help encourage and make capital available so people could access home ownership, partnered with us to begin recognizing Airbnb income when they do refis. We think this is a significant step. We're now working with a number of lending institutions on this because we do believe it is now an expansion an extension of how people can use their home, again, typically their greatest expense, to impact and change and expand their economic opportunity. Today, Brian talked about our host-led world, about Airbnb Plus. He talked about the different elements that we're leading it. This company was founded on our hosts, and it's going to continue to be organized around our hosts. The most important part of Airbnb Plus are those exceptional hosts. And I want to talk about one that I spent some time with when I was in Japan. I went to Kyoto. I met Mr. Mizuno-san here. He, in my view, is a gold medal winning host. And the reason he is not purely because he is an outstanding host, which he most certainly is. It's because the reason why he hosts. So I stayed with him. We went one morning in Kyoto to a Buddhist temple. And we're at this temple. We got to the window of enlightenment. And I asked him, like, why is it that you host? And he said, well, I grew up in a country that had faced conflict. I'm not a statesman. I'm not an elected official. I'm just a person who owns a house. But what I can do in my life in a small way by inviting people to come in and experience our culture and our people is hopefully take a small step to avoid future conflicts. And I think as much as the economics are important to our hosts, there is a community aspect to this that really makes what they do special, makes that exceptional host. On Friday, you're going to be hearing a lot more about our experiences platform, our vertical from JoBot. But we're incredibly excited about where we are. We're projected to be profitable by 2019 on this project, on this product. We've seen its growth from about a year ago go up about 2,500%. And what we're seeing, really interestingly, is just how it compares to the homes business at the same point in time. It's growing about 10 times faster than the homes business did. Now, of course, it benefits from the supply that the current homes business is creating for it. But what this reflects is that it is a product that people increasingly are using, liking, enjoying, and we are incredibly excited about what the future holds for it. Again, JoBot's going to talk about this, but I experienced it myself relatively recently. I went to Rio, and I spent about 36 hours in Rio. I got off a plane, and I sort of built my trip around a series of these experiences. I wanted to experience the city through the eyes and expertise and passions of the people of Rio. So I began with a pub crawl. By the way, this is Paulo. Paulo is a local reporter in Rio. His beat is the local pub scene, which tells you all you need to know about what a cool place Rio is, right? You actually can have a beat covering the local pubs. And so we did a pub crawl with him. After I was fueled by the various libations that I was able to enjoy, I went to a favela and did a little dancing. I have made sure that the video from this dancing has never, ever gotten out. A guy coming from the States down to Rio and dancing is a very high bar. I'm not sure I necessarily passed it. So we've only stuck with the photos. I got up the next morning and did some boxing on the beach. I had boxed a little bit as a kid. My boxing was definitely better than my dancing, but as I said, that's a very, very low bar. But certainly after all of that, I needed to be redeemed and was able to go up to the Christ the Redeemer and actually have a private dinner that night. It was very mystical. The clouds were out, the fog was out, the city was below. But in that 36 hours, I was able to explore and experience Rio in a really special way because it was done through the passions, through the eyes, through the feelings and the expertise of real people who lived there. Let me get to communities now. And when we talk about communities, we do need to talk about how they fit into the overall growth of travel. So as many of you know, travel is now 10% of the global GDP. It's bigger than big oil. 1 in 10 jobs is attached to travel and tourism. It's growing at 4% a year, faster than the rest of the economy. And then you sort of project out over the next 10 or 12 years. An emerging middle class globally, particularly in emerging markets, is going to drive even faster and accelerated growth of travel and tourism. By 2030, about 57% of all travel is going to be taking place in emerging markets. You think about who the consumer is going to be. Millennials who value experiences over material gain are going to represent over 75% of the key consumer demographic. So these are going to be the folks who are going to be traveling, and those emerging markets is going to be where most of the travel is going to be taking place. And so as we think about travel and tourism, we think about who is benefiting. Are we making sure that this is really benefiting as many people as possible? Again, tracking to the point I made earlier about taking responsibility. And we think about this in the same way that one could think about junk food and healthy food. We think about mass travel and healthy travel. And to us, there's some really core ingredients that constitute or make up what is healthy travel. Is it local? Is it authentic? Is it diverse? Is it inclusive? Is it sustainable? Let's talk about local. End of 2015, Airbnb put out something called the Policy Compact. It was our commitment to work with local governments. It comprised 3 commitments: sharing data, which we do, evolving unique policies to fit specific cities or markets, and then paying our community's fair share of taxes, which is typically hotel or tourist taxes, which exist in many parts of the world. Since we put that out, we've put in place more than 400 regulatory partnerships. These take on a variety of flavors. It can be a tax partnership, it can be a full-on legislation, it can be an MOU. But we're particularly excited about what we've done on the tax front. We've paid over $500 million in taxes since we put this in place. This is a recent tax deal we did in Mexico City. This is the mayor of Mexico City. I give the city enormous credit for thinking out of the box and thinking in a really innovative way. Here in the US, almost 60% of our hosts are now currently covered by those tax partnerships. Authentic. So almost 90% of our guests stay in non-traditional hotel districts. This means they're bringing the benefits of travel and tourism to places that typically don't benefit in a market. And half of all the money that they spend actually stays in the exact neighborhood where their listing is. We generated or supported 1.3 million jobs last year through our guest spending in these areas. And to sort of put a fine point on that, you can look at the specific impact that we had on local restaurants. In our top 44 cities in the world, we generated $6.5 billion for those local restaurants. Diverse. Airbnb is based here in San Francisco, but the majority of our business takes place outside of the United States. Over 80% of our business actually is outside of the US, meaning because our hosts keep most of the money, that the vast majority of the economics are actually staying in the communities where the activity is in fact taking place. This next slide really puts our growth in perspective. And when we were sort of formally launched in 2009, about 94% of our business was in our top 20 markets. Today, a little bit less than 20% of our business is in that top 20 markets, and now 80% of our business is outside of that. Back in 2009, we had 0 markets where we had more than 100,000 people traveling to annually. Today, we have 265 markets and climbing where there's more than 100,000 guests traveling to those places on an annual basis. I talked earlier about the emerging markets. We have triple-digit growth in many of those emerging markets. Again, portending where we're going as a platform. In fact, by 2030, we project out that we'll have 28 million Airbnb hosts in these emerging markets. We're also in rural places. We're working in France to drive travel and tourism to rural farms. Here in the US, a partnership with the US Park Service to help promote travel to rural parts of the US. This chart sort of shows how we can impact travel to rural areas. This is the path of totality when the eclipse came over the US. The green dots on this map represent the hotels. You can see there's large swaths of the US in these rural markets where there simply are not hotels, they're not needed, they couldn't be sustained. These red dots right here represent the Airbnbs that were generated and created over and around the path of totality. We were able to help send more than 50,000 people into these places. And so folks who typically would never have benefited from travel or tourism, were able to use their homes because of the path of totality and be able to make extra money. Inclusive, something that we're really proud of what we've been able to accomplish here. Over 50% of our hosts are women. Very rare in any type of economic sector where women are the majority of the income earners. Our fastest growing cohort of hosts are seniors. They typically earn fixed incomes. They often have extra space or they're traveling. And they also like the relationships and the social connections that are derived from home sharing. We've worked with any number of organizations to try to drive and work to drive travel and tourism, the economic benefits of it to historically underserved communities. The UNWTO, the World Bank, UNHCR, the NAACP here in the US, and have done some really interesting partnerships working in India to promote opportunities for working women in India. In South Africa, we've established partnerships to drive travel and tourism to townships. The photo there is a place called Kayaicha. I spent a night there when I was in South Africa a couple months ago. In Jordan, working with refugees through our Experiences product to offer experiences for those refugees. And then with the NAACP, as I mentioned, looking to create hosting opportunities in any number of urban markets in the US. And finally, the sustainable piece. Traveling on Airbnb has a 63% less of an impact on carbon than staying in a traditional or conventional hotel. You can see how we're able to impact communities typically around big events. During the Rio Olympics, by being able to generate accommodations via our hosts, we were able to save the building of 257 hotels. Hotels typically require concrete. Concrete is one of the biggest contributors to CO2 emissions. And we know our guests are specifically looking to travel on Airbnb because they see it as the environmental option when they travel. And also think about the number of empty homes that exist in the world, a huge number in any number of places. These are places where the carbon has already been emitted because the places have been constructed. Are we able to use those, convert those into tourism opportunities? We're working right now in Japan with little villages in Italy and parts of the Caribbean to be able to convert empty houses into economic generators. And so ultimately, what we want to do is become a 21st century company. And what that really goes to is that we are committed to working with the various stakeholders to align their interests. In fact, the only way Airbnb is going to continue to grow and go in the direction that we want it to go in is if we are aligning the interests of our stakeholders. And if we do that, we're also working in our own way to take responsibility and work to align what tech is doing, at least our tech, with the economy, with governments, and ultimately to the best interest of society. And as I said earlier, Airbnb is not the solution to the big challenges that we face. We can do our part, but I do think there is an awful lot to be said about the community model when it comes to the role it can play as a potential model for folks to look at when they think about the impact of technology on the world. Ultimately for us, that community model is allowing us to help people, right? We're using technology to economically empower our hosts at a time of economic inequality and when those folks are potentially being challenged by robotics to be replaced or displaced. We're using technology to actually connect people offline in a real world at a time when algorithms are increasingly polarizing and segmenting and putting people into digital bubbles. We're using our technology to try to work with communities to actually drive healthy tourism, to drive tourism that will help those cities deal with the challenge of climate change. Now, we talked today, Brian introduced the concept of the roadmap to get to 1 billion people. That's ultimately in advancing our mission that anyone can belong anywhere, and with a particular focus on that everyone component. Now, the one area where I do think we can be a real leader on, and that we have a responsibility to be a real leader on, is in the travel space. And as we think about the future, then we can look to the relatively recent past to guide us. On New Year's, this past year, we had almost around 3 million people spend a night on the platform. That is a record for an accommodation company. We don't say that to pound our chest, but because we do think it says something pretty profound. That in a time period when there's conversations about building walls, about travel bans, about people living in these digital bubbles, around 3 million people arrived somewhere in one of those 191 countries. They knocked on a door, many of them, and were invited in by folks that they had never met before. They were treated like a family member. And at the end of that, many of those folks left and many of them left no longer as strangers, but as friends. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with this platform, is to drive that belonging. Again, I thank you very much for being here, for coming and covering us. I look forward to taking your questions, and again, really, really appreciate the time and interest.